stories, The Japanese Wife, the title story of which was made into a film by Aparna Sen. Jash Sen graduated in statistics, completed her MBA from IIM Calcutta, worked in Bangalore and the US before opting to teach. She has 2 published novels. May I please call on stage, Josh is already on stage, Kunal, please.
Yeah, I think that's. Good evening, and a very warm welcome to all of you who are attending this session. We have Kunal Basu here with us today, and he needs no introduction, of course. What we propose to do is introduce the 2 books that are coming out. One of them is from Penguin, and it's Sarojini's Mother, the latest English work by Kunal. And I have with me Picador's English translation of Mr. Basu's Tejoshini O Shabnam, which is a work in Bangla. It's been translated by Arunava Sinha, and it's called The Endgame. So both of these books are out and will be available, of course, at the bookstore. But I thought we would spend the next 40-odd minutes just chatting about individually first Sarojini's Mother and then The Endgame, and then we take a few questions from you. I'm sure you'll have a fair few. Kunalda, Sarojini's Mother, of course, this hard copy just reached up my hands today. I read it on the computer yesterday, and it was riveting. But I'd like you to tell us more about what the story's about and how you came upon the idea.
Thank you. Sarojini's Mother is a story about a young English girl called Sarojini, who was adopted at birth from India, taken by her English mother to England, and raised there. And Sarojini, when she comes of age, decides to come to India to look for her biological mother. Now, this is a common theme, right? A few years back, there was a film that won an Oscar award called Lion, okay? It was a story about an adoptee who comes back to India to look for her in that case, his biological mother. Now, research shows that only about 5% of those who come to look for their biological parents actually find them. So they go through lots of search, and in the end, they find their mother in a remote village or in a slum, and there's a grand reunion. This is the kind of stuff that Hollywood loves. Now, 95% of those who come looking for their biological parents never find them. And they go back home, wherever that might be, disheartened, brokenhearted. Okay? Some of them lose faith in God. Okay? Life loses meaning. To me, both these scenarios were not attractive. Okay? Finding a mother and not finding a mother. So this novel is about Sarojini coming to Calcutta to look for her biological mother. And what does she find? She finds 2 mothers. Okay? There's enough circumstantial evidence that a woman called Jomuna might be her mother. And Jomuna is a housemaid who lives in a slum. And the other woman who claims to be her mother is Urvashi, who's a high society lady who has a fashion boutique of her own. And there's also some circumstantial evidence that Urvashi might be Sarojini's mother. So Sarojini is in the middle. She's pulled in 2 different directions. And in this novel, among many other things, she questions, what is she really looking for? Who has she come to search? What does mother mean for her? And if she chooses one mother, remember, not only will she choose one woman, but she will choose one part of India. If she chooses the other woman, she gets the other part of India. So that's what this novel is about.
So this book is loosely based on the Caucasian chalk circle, or rather, it kind of springboards from the original, the germ of the Caucasian chalk circle, so to speak. But when I read it, I actually felt that apart from the very, very initial connection, it's very much its own story in its own world. And I did want to ask you, where does Brecht end? Where does Kunal Basu begin? I mean, in your mind, did you demarcate it in any way?
You know, if you ask any author, they will tell you that the epigram, the quote that appears in the beginning of a novel, is hardly the inspiration for that novel. Okay, and is often an afterthought. It is often a quote that seems to match the context of the novel. It's a scene setter. So was it for Sarojini's mother. I was not consciously guided by Bertolt Brecht, nor by this famous story of Solomon's judgment in Old Testament. Some people claim that the story even goes further back than the Bible, and its origins are in the West, in the East, in India. The genesis of this novel was very curious, and it took birth in 2 or 3 different places. Have you seen Diwar, this classic film called Diwar?
No, but I just know a couple of lines from it.
Oh, yeah. Everybody knows that Diwar line, right? The most iconic line in Bollywood. So in this scene, Amitabh Bachchan confronts Shashi Kapoor, and he says, "Mera paas bangla hai, gaadi hai, property hai, building hai, kya hai tumhara paas?" And Shashi Kapoor looks plaintively at him and says, "Mere paas maa hai."
Okay. Now, that's the line I do know.
Mere paas maa hai. See, when I saw Diwar in the 70s in Kolkata years back, you know, it was not completely satisfactory to me, this particular line. Because what it does is, it reduces a mother into really a very uninteresting character. What is a mother there for? To offer unconditional love. And what does a child do? Offers unconditional love back. Now, what do you do with a relationship like that? You can't write about it. There are no nuances. Okay? Whereas we know, all of us who've had mothers or have mothers, we know that the mother-child relationship is the most complex relationship on earth. And it's a relationship that changes over time. You know, sometimes we become mad at our mothers. I'm sure our mothers become mad at us. Okay? Sometimes we manipulate our mothers manipulate us. Okay? It's a relationship of sometimes of great trust, sometimes of great distrust. Okay? So like all human relationships, the mother and child relationship is also open to literary exploration, which is what I've tried to do in this novel. There's a line in this novel when the protagonist, the person who narrates the novel, a guy called Elvis, okay? Why Elvis? Because he dresses like Elvis and he sings Elvis songs. His band members tell him, "Look, you've made a mistake. You've confused a noun with an adjective. Mother is a noun. Motherly is an adjective." Okay? So that you can have a mother who's not motherly. You can have a person who's very motherly, but is not your biological mother. Right? So what is Sarojini really looking for? Is she looking for a very special relationship, or does she want a fact to be established, a biological fact about her life?
So motherhood rather than motherliness, sort of, I think. This is, after Kolkata, sort of your second back-to-back book set in this city. And of course, I was struck by the different worlds. I mean, Kolkata had a different set of universes from within the city. And this was, you know, it was such a beautifully curated set of scenes and locations of this city, suited to this story, suited to sort of the flavor of this story. And I wondered how you picked, how you chose, how did you create these little set pieces of the city? I mean.
You know, a very famous Bengali poet, Shankho Ghosh, once wrote a poem where he said, "Ei Kolkatar moddhe ache arekta Kolkata, Babu Moshai dekhte shikhun." Inside this Calcutta, there is another Calcutta. Open your eyes. Okay. So obviously, like all major metropolises, Kolkata is not one city. And I always believe that this is a city that can surprise me as a writer. Because if I write a dozen novels which are set in Kolkata, each of these novels and their settings of Kolkata will be very different from each other. They'll be different because the stories are different, the characters are different, things that they're looking for are different. So in Kolkata, my previous novel about a male prostitute called Jamshed Alam, who lives in Kolkata, it was all about Zakaria Street, about Chitpur. Okay? It was a part of Kolkata where Bengalis are in a minority. Okay? It was a very different worldview that that particular novel brought forward. This novel is in many ways about Kolkata, which is all around us. So there's things that happen in the Indian Museum, which is practically across the street. Then there is Southern Street, where you have all these hostels where backpackers come and stay. Okay? So when Sarojini first comes to Kolkata, where does she stay? She stays in a backpacking lodge on Southern Street. And she doesn't know anything about where her mother might be. So she goes around putting up notices in tea shops and restaurants saying, can you help me find my mother? And she offers a reward of 50,000 rupees. Okay? When suddenly this character called Elvis appears on the scene. Okay? And Elvis and Sarojini become a pair as they start searching and looking for who might be that woman who is Sarojini's mother. And that search takes them to slums. It takes them to the Bengal Club, which is not far from here. It takes them to Khidirpur on a ride on a number 36 tram. It takes them to all kinds of destinations.
In fact, I wanted to ask you to read a bit from Sarojini's mother. There's a bit that's set in the National Museum, and of course it's right across. And I just wanted to share with you how much the city comes alive. I mean, just one of many, many bits.
So this is a part where Sarojini is utterly confused. Okay? And she almost commits herself to Jamuna as being her daughter. And she also almost commits herself to being a daughter to Urvashi. And of course, Elvis is very unhappy with her. She's saying, what are you doing? You're playing with the emotions of two women. You have to make up your mind. Okay? You can't screw up their lives. And this conversation happens, as you will see, not too far from here. You feel you are in London, not Calcutta, as soon as you walk into the National Museum. Once called the Imperial Museum, it was the nation's oldest and largest. Villagers who thronged there on holidays called it Jadughar, the house of enchantments. I took Saz to the museum to bring up a delicate matter. Why do they charge foreigners 25 times more than Indians? Saz asked after she had paid her entrance fee of 500 rupees. Because the average Brit is 25 times richer than the average Indian, I quipped. Nonsense. Saz dismissed my explanation as we joined the queue of bored high schoolers bussed in for a day of extracurricular studies. Giant columns and arched doorways took us back to 1814, when there was no shortage of poor laborers who could be recruited to build impressive buildings. There were 14 galleries at the museum, and the rush, understandably, was for the mammal gallery, full of dead animals stuffed with brine. Avoiding the mammals, we took refuge among the paintings. Saz was drawn to black and white engravings of company men and women among their subordinates. Lucy would have disapproved, Saz said. Lucy is her English mother. Examining a memsahib fawned over in her bath by native maids. One of them was helping her put on her evening gown. Another combed her hair. A third was applying lotion to her feet. Why would she disapprove? Because she believed that no person should be made to serve the vanity of another. Her face broke out into a smile as she examined the engraving closely. But she would have approved of the dress, gauzy and shimmering, showing her privates almost. We flitted from wall to wall, and I was happy to see that Saz was enjoying herself, not suffering anymore from her Calcutta asthma. A couple of schoolgirls were giggling over a miniature painting of a copulating couple, and Saz winked at them before moving on. You never take me sightseeing anywhere, so why did you bring me here? Saz asked once we had exited the painting gallery. To see the mummy, I replied. Mummy? She exclaimed, and I told her about the prize exhibit of the House of Enchantments. It is more than 4,000 years old and was received as a gift from a British cavalry lieutenant in 1882. There's a rebellion on the ship and it was brought over from Egypt. The sailors considered it to be an evil spirit. Why bring a mummy over from Egypt to Calcutta? Saz sounded genuinely surprised. The reason wasn't clear to me, but it could have had something to do with the British moving their possessions around like a rich man moves a vase from the hallway to the parlor. Because of its eerie reputation, the mummy room was the quietest spot in the museum, perfect to raise the delicate matter with Saz. Wrapped in cloth, with arms tied down to the sides, the mummy looked fragile. The face and the head had crumbled, leaving the bones exposed. The funeral mask had been replaced on its chest, and the coffin's blue light gave the impression of a recently excavated tomb. Can you imagine what would happen if the museum suffered a power cut? I started cautiously. It'd create a panic, wouldn't it? Saz replied without taking her eyes off the exhibit. Yes, it'd be a catastrophe. Visitors wouldn't know which way to go to leave the building. Young ones especially. There could be a stampede. Not unless the guards were quick to act, directing everyone to leave in an orderly fashion. Precisely. I was glad Saz and I were thinking along similar lines. All depends on the guards, if they feel the confusion and pain suffered by the trapped visitors. All will be lost if they hesitate. Raising her head slowly from the mummy resting under glass, Saz gave me a long look. You're trying to tell me something, aren't you? It was my turn to peer inside the glass case, giving Saz a chance to digest everything. You think I'm holding everyone up? Screwing up lives? Not doing what I'm supposed to do? Like some heartless guard, I've turned a blind eye to the sufferings of others, turned Jamuna and Urvasi's life into misery. You must think I've been really cruel. You do need to tell them something, I think. Tell them what? That I'm confused? That after a month here, I'm not any closer to the truth than I've been at any time during the past 27 years? By not telling them, you're giving them hope. My voice echoed in the empty room. Each of them thinks you belong to them. Jamuna waits for a daughter in jail. Urvasi at her boutique. They've told their friends, made grand preparations to celebrate once you give the green signal. You're holding their breath, waiting for a simple nod from you to let go. Are you accusing me of playing with their emotions? Her voice rose louder than mine. Then she turned her back to the mummy to face me. What about them playing with mine? But you would have expected that when you came over, didn't you? I took a harder tone with Saz than I'd taken before. How can it not be emotional for a mother who needs to get her child back more than anything else? Shaking, Saz held the guardrails of the exhibit, speaking laboriously. Yes, they've been needy, you can say that. Both of them, without stopping for a moment to think what my need might be. Why have I come this far to look for my mother, leaving my life behind? Neither has asked what they mean to me, how strong a daughter has to be to choose a mother.
Wow. So this is a story with multiple heroes. We obviously heard Saz and Elvis in this piece, but there are so many other prominent characters. And I did wonder how you managed to give them all their space and not have them fight for attention in the story. They sort of all gel so beautifully.
You know, many of them were attractive to me in their own way. So, take Elvis. In Kolkata, you have this phenomenon of Bengali boys and girls, middle class, who lead very middle class lives, but in their minds, they're somewhere else. So for example, I have this cousin, this cousin lives not far from where I do, in South Kolkata, goes to the same lake market, goes to the same tea shop, takes a bus or a tram to work, but in his mind, he's Bob Dylan. He dresses like Bob Dylan. He's no kid. He dresses like Bob Dylan. He plays a guitar. very badly. Okay. He sings Bob Dylan songs, only Bob Dylan songs, very badly. Okay. But in his mind, honestly, he's not making it up. For the past 30 years of his life, he has been Bob Dylan. Okay. So in this story of mine, you've got this character called Chiru Sen. He lost his father at an early age, raised by his mother, who's very fastidious. And in his mind, he's Elvis. So he has this, the sideburns. He has this loop, hair loop on his head. He wears these shimmering Elvis dresses. Nobody understands him except his neighborhood tailor. And he goes to his tailor, takes out a photograph, and he says, "You need a dress like Mr. Elvis? I can make you one." Okay. So Elvis becomes friend, philosopher, and guide, and the voice of conscience to Saz, to Sarojini, saying that, look, you have a mission in life, the things that you're looking for, but bear in mind, others do too. They have their lives to lead. Then you've got a guy called Suleiman. He's a bookie of the race course. Again, the race course is right behind us. Okay, and you know what? I had never been to see a race in my life. When we were kids growing up, it was considered to be sinful to go to the races. Okay, but in order to write this novel, I started going to the races, meeting with the bookies, becoming friends with them, and I have a character called Suleiman, who's like the great King Solomon of Israel. In other words, he is the fountainhead of all wisdom of all times. Okay, so when Saz is trapped and she doesn't know how to choose, okay, then Suleiman offers the words of wisdom, and he says, "You must tempt the heart to bear itself." And this is how you tempt the heart. Now, what he suggests, I won't tell you, because that's going to give away the novel.
So, Birla Planetarium is just across, and it features in the book as well. And I must admit, in all these years of living in Kolkata, I have never been there. But I promise I shall.
Have to go. You
I
must
shall.
go. In the Birla Planetarium, people go not to watch the stars. This is what I realized. When I went back to do my research in Birla Planetarium, first of all, I felt like a fish out of water because they were all young couples, And they were all busy with each other. It was dark. It was, there were stars up there. Nobody was listening to this commentary about the galaxy and the Milky Way and all of that. Okay. So, one point in the story, Sarojini tells Elvis, "You never take me anywhere. You take me to hospitals. You take me to museums. You've never taken me to a romantic place." And Elvis takes her to the Birla Planetarium. Okay, and there's a scene inside the Birla Planetarium. Now I cannot pass the Birla Planetarium without chuckling.
I actually thought you might choose the Victoria Memorial as a more obvious backdrop, but this worked much better for me. And I have to admit, it brought out the latent tourist in me. There are places in Kolkata I go past, I drive past, I don't walk into. And now, after Sarojini's
but you know
mother,
what? Where you should go? You should go to Galib Bar, but you should never go alone.
This is another venue. I mean, I read about it and I thought, okay, can't go, but I must ask about it. But could you tell us about Galib Bar, actually?
So
I'm never going there alone.
No. That's a health advisory, actually. Okay. So Galib Bar is on Elliott Street. Okay, and it's a rough bar. Okay, there's some nice characters there and some not so nice characters. And when I was writing Kolkata, I used to go to Galib Bar often. And one time the owner came and said, "Why do you come here?" And I said, I'm writing a book, I'm writing a novel. And he said, "Oh yes, people say they are writers, but when they go out, they forget everything about writing. They only remember what they've done here." Okay. So, Galib Bar is also a setting, and the scene in Galib Bar is actually it's a threatening scene that I've written. There are parts of Calcutta that seem very innocuous, that seem very friendly, but suddenly Kolkata can change character and turn out to be a dangerous beast, as it does for Sarojini at the Galib Bar.
Now, coming to the Endgame, which is the other book that we're discussing today. The Endgame is originally a Bangla story called Tejoshini or Shabnam. So I wanted to ask you how it came about. This is set in the Iraq War, and it has two Bengali women protagonists. And of course, that in itself was unusual enough for me. But I really wanted to ask you how you thought about it.
So, Tejoshini or Shabnam is my third Bangla novel. The fourth has just come out, and it's called Angel. the genesis of this book was very different to Sarojini's. Okay, very, very different. So about a year and a half back, a film production company in Mumbai approached me and said, we want you to write us a story for a film, and we want it to be a story about trafficking. And I said, no, look, this is not what I do. I don't take orders in terms of subjects and then turn them into stories. That's not what I'm about. I write fiction, I write novels and short stories, and should someone be interested in making a film, then they can make me an offer, okay? But there was a small voice in the back of my head which said, Kunal, don't be hasty, okay? Because if you take this opportunity of actually exploring the world of trafficking and traffickers, you might learn something that you never learned before. And I should tell you, my life as a fiction writer means entering doors that I've never entered before. It means experiencing things that I've never experienced before. So I said, okay, I will do it. If you can introduce me to young girls who have been rescued from trafficking, and if you can introduce me to traffickers. They said, fine. And so one morning, I drove from our house in South Kolkata to a place called Shandeshkhali, which is not far. It's in North Chobbish Pargona, which is about an hour and 20 minutes, hour and 30 minutes from Kolkata. That close, where a group of young girls who had been rescued by NGOs from trafficking were waiting for me to be interviewed. And I went well armed. I went with pad and paper and recorder, and I was taken into a small schoolhouse without a roof, decrepit, broken down. And there were these 11 girls, age ranging from about 15 to 22, waiting there to speak with me. And I couldn't ask a single question. I broke down. The ferocity of it struck me in the face. We read about trafficking in newspaper reports. We hear TV anchors talking about trafficking. But seeing these little girls, it completely broke my heart and it filled me with rage. I asked one of these little girls, where did they take you? Kothay giyechile tumi? And she said, Arab deshe. She didn't even know which Arabian country. She said, Arab deshe. Can you imagine the ferocity of a 15-year-old girl going from a South Chobbish Pargona village to the Middle East as a sex worker? And all the 11 pairs of eyes blended together and created Shabnam for me. I did not write that story for the film company, but I wrote a novel called Tejoshini or Shabnam, a story about two women, Tejoshini Ray, a CNN journalist, a no-nonsense, a real brave heart who comes from New York to cover the war in Iraq after the death of Saddam Hussein. And who does she meet? She meets an entertainer, a belly dancer, a person, a comfort woman in the American Marine camp, and that's Shabnam. And so these two very unlikely women, Tejoshini from New York and Shabnam from Chobbish Pargona, become friends. Okay, and the story is about what happens next.
So there's this moment where Tejoshini first meets Shabnam, and I'm going to ask Kunalda to read that, to Segan from this discussion.
This is a very short piece. So, Tejoshini has seen glimpses of Shabnam, but she's never really met her. She wonders, who is this woman? She doesn't look Arabian. She looks Indian. She has a bindi on her forehead. Could she be Bengali? How has she come here? But these are questions she doesn't have answers to because she's never met Shabnam. This is where she meets her. The desert moon had risen in a sky with a billion stars. A dry canal lay a little farther down the village road outside the barbed wire fence. Crossing the canal bridge, Tejo jumped over the demolished wall of Nimrud to enter the ruins. Stepping carefully past the stone slabs, she proceeded towards the palace, the residence of Ashur-Nashirpal II, 884 to 859 BC. The world had forgotten ancient Assyria, but the marble columns were still there. A waterfall flowed through here in ancient times, much before the Bible was written. Fragrance of mulberries came from the adjoining farmhouse, where guests were welcomed with wine and meat, looked after by slave girls. Tejo stopped in front of the 30-foot tall Lamasu, the demonic deity of the Assyrians. I slayed like a demon, Ashur Nashirpal had boasted. His monstrous deeds were inscribed on slabs of stone. I burnt my enemies, cut off their arms and legs, noses and ears of children, and buried them in the sand. Blinded the warriors and set them adrift in the desert. I didn't spare the tiniest bit of land from my conquest, grew a harvest of corpses on Nineveh's farm, and offered them to the great Lamasu. The king's burial chamber lay beneath the palace. The queen's quarters nestled behind the balconies, away from prying eyes. Tejo tripped on something and caught herself from falling. Nimrud was lit up in the moonlight. There were hidden treasures of ivory, copper, and gold in these ruins. An imposing figure stood on the parapet. Was she the empress of Nimrud? Her headscarf fluttered in the breeze, an arm crossed over her breasts. It was impossible to mistake her for marble. Tejo heard the sounds of the dead city and the sound of a woman breathing. The hooting of an owl brought her back to her senses. Who are you? She shouted at the figure. Her voice echoed in the ruins, brought the figure to life. Who are you? She called out again. The dancer turned her eyes towards her. Her voice came from the heart of the marble. Shabnam.
Now, I wanted to ask you why you asked someone else to translate your book. This book is very ably translated by Arunava Sinha, of course, but since Kunalda writes both in Bengali and English, it did cross my mind to ask him why not translate your own work.
First of all, I find translations to be very tedious. It's very hard. The second is, imagine you're a student in class, in high school, and you've written an essay, and your teacher says, it's a very good essay, I just want you to rewrite it. By then, you have exhausted your passion, In writing this novel, I have exhausted my passion. And by the way, this is the same thing I told Aparna Sen when she was thinking of doing the film, The Japanese Wife. And she said, why don't you write the screenplay for this story? And I said, no, I don't want to do this. I've exhausted my passion writing the story. It's now your passion that must breathe life into this film.
So what is next for you in terms of, I know Angel is coming out in Bangla. What's your next book?
Well, the next little while is endless traveling for me because I have these two books, a Bengali novel, and the Hindi translation of my second novel, The Miniaturist, is also due out soon. It's called Chitrakar at the Jaipur Literary Festival. So as much as I would like to get into my new novel, I cannot write now for the next couple of months, sort of doing my traveling around the country. But I have thought of a story which is keeping me awake at night. As we were chatting before our session, I've written historical novels, but I'm not a historian. I've written a novel where trafficking plays a main role, but I'm not a sociologist. Okay? I do not write themes. I do not write topics. I write stories, which means a story needs to appear in my mind, and it has to then completely engross me and sort of keep me awake at night so that I can't escape from it. Okay? Which is what happened, by the way, for Kolkata. My agent in London and my publisher kept saying, Kunal, you're a Kolkata boy. You're a Calcutta boy. Why don't you write a novel about Calcutta? And I said, I haven't yet thought of a story about Calcutta, which is engrossing, exciting. Otherwise, I'm just going to end up writing about the Victoria Memorial, which everybody has written about, and it's boring. I need to find a story that keeps me awake at night, and which fortunately I did. Likewise, I'm now thinking of a story which is keeping me awake at night, but it is stopping me from reaching there because I have other things to do.
Now, Opium Clark, The Miniaturist, they're all, this whole diverse set of stories across time, across cultures. And I'm sure there must be a germ or a starting point for each one of them as a writer that would kickstart your process. But tell us about any one of them that have, really, really stuck in your mind, that really appealed to you?
You know, story making is the most, to me, is the most exciting part of novels. Okay, we had Joanne Harris in the morning at the inaugural session. I don't know whether you were here. The author has written this very famous novel called Chocolat. Okay, and she was also talking about story making and storytelling, because that's what we do. We are not in the business of truth. We're in the business of lies, in the business of believable lies and not harmful lies. Okay, so every novel or a story has a different starting point. It can be sparked off by a conversation. And let me give you, just tell you the story of the Japanese wife, which is probably a story that you may know, okay, or you may have seen the film. Okay, so school teacher of mathematics in the Sundarbans meets and marries a Japanese woman from Japan over letters. They never meet. They never meet in their entire lives, but they remain married for 25 years. Okay, so it's a story about great affection and love without any proximity or without any intimacy. It's a very unusual story. Why did I think of this story? So several decades back, when I was a student in this city and had no intention of writing a novel or a book or anything really, I was a political activist. Okay? And I was traveling with one of my comrades to a village in Bengal. And when this friend of mine pointed to a middle-aged, portly gentleman, balding, dhoti kurta, in a jetty, and said, "See, Kunal, that man has a Japanese wife." Now remember, in a city like Calcutta, or for that matter, for most metropolises, people do have foreign spouses, right? You can have a foreign spouse. But in a village in South Bengal, for somebody to have a spouse, and that too not an American or French and English or German, but a Japanese? Okay. Now, I could have asked my friend a whole ton of questions. I could have said, well, has he ever been to Japan? Did he meet her because she was a tourist who came to Bengal? Do they have children? What language do the kids speak? You know, a whole ton of questions. And very fortunately, I did not ask my friend a single question. Okay. I was so engrossed with what I was doing then, committing the revolution for India, in India, that it seemed to be a side note, a footnote in my travels. And 25 years later, on a cold night in Montreal where I lived, when a snowstorm was raging outside my window, I wrote the story of the Japanese wife, which tells you the human brain is so complex and perplexing. Okay? So it picks up ideas, thoughts, not ideas, but thoughts, anecdotes, a picture, okay, a few words overheard, and spins in the mind, and they come out as stories.
Now, Kunalda, you've been an actor. You are a writer. You've talked about painting as a hobby, and you call yourself an accidental academic. And of course, in Bangla, we call this, Bahumukhi Pratibha, a multi-talented person. But which would you pick, apart from writing, if you had to pick any one of the other three?
I never wanted to be an author. I mean, it's a very strange thing. When I was reading out Manishankar Mukherjee's letter to Kolkata Literary Meet this morning, because Shankar, of course, is ill and he couldn't come to the inauguration. So he asked me to read out. And one of the things that he'd written is, I never wanted to be an author. Okay. Now, I did not want to be an author because my mother was an author and my father was a publisher. Okay. I wanted to be an artist. And that's what all I wanted to be, is to be an artist, to be nothing else, but to be an artist. And then I became a child actor for Mrinal Sen and acted in cinema. So my second A in my life was acting, okay, art, and then as an actor. And then sort of twists of fate made me an academic, which was the third A, the least preferred of the A's. And then finally, I gravitated towards the fourth of the A's, which is being an author. If I had to do it all over again, I would be an artist. There was this famous line by Degas, the artist, who said, if I had to lead my life all over again, I would do it in black and white. Okay? So that's what I would like to do.
Now, I've been hogging the mic for a very long time, and we have about 15 minutes. So I'm going to open the floor to the audience for your questions. There's a mic that's going to go around, and we'll start with you, sir.
You see, I have not read a novel in the last 50 years. I've read it earlier, but listening to you, I'm excited to read your novels to start with. And which one in English I should start with of yours?
Thank you, sir. It's the greatest compliment that an author can receive. It's much more than a prize or an award. That should an author inspire a person to pick up a book and read is perhaps the greatest compliment, so I thank you for that. Since in my earlier response, I said that I would have liked to have become an artist, perhaps you could read my second novel, which is called The Miniaturist. It's a novel about a child prodigy, an artist, who grows up in Emperor Akbar's court in Fatehpur Sikri. And he's so talented, he's a child prodigy, that everybody thinks that when he grows up, he will be the emperor's chief artist, except he doesn't. And he's thrown out of Akbar's court. Okay? And it asks fundamental questions about what is it about art that attracts us? And I ask likewise, what is it about writing that is so important to us? So perhaps The Miniaturist.
So, am I audible?
Sorry?
Am I audible?
Yeah, go on.
My name is Oishi. I'm a student of Jadavpur University. I wanted to ask you about your Bengali novel, Robi Shankar. So I want to ask you, why did you choose that period? Or is it that your own years as an activist which reflected in that novel? Why choose the 70s? I mean,
I don't choose settings, I don't choose periods, I don't choose themes. I write stories. Okay. Now, because I was a student growing up in the 70s in Kolkata and in Jadavpur University, by the way, the then Chief Minister of Bengal, Siddhartha Shankar Rai, once famously said, "It is safer to walk through the jungles of Sundarban at night than to walk through the campus of Jadavpur University during daylight." Okay, so that was the Jadavpur University I grew up in, and it must have done something to me, because what this story the Robi Shankar is about this guy who was a Nakshal activist in the 70s, who then sort of leaves the politics, becomes a very successful doctor. And he goes off to England to practice, and he comes back, as many NRIs come back to India after a certain point in time, and becomes a doctor in India. He is established, he's a member of the Calcutta Club, he's a part of the social elite. And who does he meet? Accidentally, he meets the police officer who had tortured him at Lal Bazaar. And an unlikely relationship develops between the torturer and the tortured, between this ex-Nakshal and this ex-police officer. Okay. So I thought of this story, and I thought it might be worthwhile to write it. There's a question up here.
Yeah, we need the mic in front, please. Oh, yeah.
Small question. How do you choose which novel to write in which language? How do you choose the language?
I've been asked this question before. It's an important question. When I think of a story, in the early genesis of the story, either I see an image or I hear characters speaking amongst themselves and the gist of a story. Okay. Famously, Mozart once said, "I saw the symphony in the blink of an eye." How do you see a symphony? I don't know. Okay. Now, I certainly see early images of a novel that I'm going to write, and these images suggest to me the language. For example, The Japanese Wife could have been written in Bangla. It's a novel which is set in Sundarban. Okay. The main character who dominates the pages is a Bengali, Snehomay Chakraborty. Okay. His Mashi is a Bengali. Okay. All the villages are Bengali. So why did I write it in English? Because when the story appeared in my mind, the first line jumped out of it. And that line was, "She sent him kites." The Japanese wife sent Snehomoy, his husband that she has never met in her life, a box of Japanese kites. Okay? And these box of Japanese kites are riding on the Matla, the river, on a boat, and arriving in Snehomoy's village. That's the opening scene of the story. And the first line was, she sent him kites. When I thought of this line, I had no option but to write the novel in English. When my agent in England heard the story of the Endgame, or Sarojini Shabnam, she said, why didn't you write the novel in English? It's such a global novel. The Iraq War, 2 women, one from New York, one from Bengal. Why on earth didn't you write this novel in English? I said, but you see, the novel took shape when I was in North Chobish Pargona. And the words that I heard in my ears, the village that I was going around in, the whole entire domain of trafficking, traffickers, NGOs, etc., was full of words that were spoken in Bangla. And so my imagination was fertilized in Bangla, so I wrote it in Bangla. Okay? So it's not a strategy to write in one or the other. It's an early artistic suggestion that leads me to choose.
Actually, it is, however, I felt a decision to write in both languages. And I wanted to ask you about that a bit. You know, very few people choose to decide to write in 2 languages.
You know, for many, many years, I'd lived in Montreal, in French Canada, in Quebec, which is part English, part French. And the Quebecois, they pride themselves and they say that we are the most bilingual people on earth. And I used to quarrel with them and said, no, the Bengalis are the most bilingual people on earth. Because bilingualism doesn't mean speaking, reading, and writing both languages in a grammatically correct form. Bilingualism is more than that. It means having 2 literary streams flow within you. And you can jump from one to the other without having to seek anybody's permission. Now, I've been saying all of these things, but it struck me that actually I have not written in Bangla, written a piece of fiction in Bangla. I keep saying these things. I even gave an interview in Anandobajar Potrika where I said, Ami Ingrej Bangali noi, Ami Bangali. Ami Ingrej Bangali noi, Ami Bangali. Most authors of Indian writers who write in English are not comfortable in their vernacular. Okay? But Ami Ingrej Bangali noi. But then I said, well, but I haven't written in Bangla. And that, in some sense, for me, was the starting point in writing the first novel, Robi Shankar. Then I couldn't stop. So I wrote 4 Bangla novels in a trot. Over 2 years, I wrote 4 Bangla novels. And then I went back and wrote Sarojini's Mother in English. Yeah.
Just hang on. I just wait for the mic. Yeah.
Hi, sorry. Do you find it more you're comfortable with one language or the other? Or
No. I think, again, the stories for me suggest the language. And once I've thought of a story in that particular language, then I feel quite comfortable writing it in that language. Now, I would probably find difficult to write the Opium Clerk in Bangla, because that story suggested itself to me. It's a colonial novel set in Calcutta, Canton, and Kuching. And it came to me, all the innuendos of that novel were in English. It's okay.
as we say in Bengali, like, আপনার মুন্সিয়ানাটা কোথায় মানে
আমার মুন্সিয়ানা তো পাঠক বুঝবে আদৌ মুন্সিয়ানা আছে কিনা সেইটাই বা কে জানে
Yeah, we need the mic at the back there, please. Yeah.
Hello. Like the gentleman out there, I'm also tempted to start reading your book. I would perhaps go by the latest one, Sarojini's Mother, because you mentioned about the 2 socio-economic, the extremes of Calcutta, of the 2 mothers. And as you just mentioned about your political background, I think that makes the whole story much layered. Could you please throw some more light on that?
There is a tendency, which I've tried to avoid, in seeing the world in black and white, okay? Saying that Jamuna, the lady from the slum, is all virtuous, and the lady Urboshi from the Bengal Club, who frequents the Bengal Club, is commercial, is crass and crude and all of that, which is not so in my novel. Both are erstwhile mothers. Both have suffered their own wounds. Both have lost their child. There cannot be a greater tragedy, I think, on earth, a mother losing a child. There cannot be a greater tragedy. Okay? And so both of these characters are layered characters. Okay? I've traversed both of these worlds. I've traversed the world of the slum. I've traversed the world of high fashion, haute couture, stuff like that. And I've tried to bring out that no matter what their external appearances might be, there are layers to their personality and there are layers to their sensitivities.
Next question. Anyone? Yeah, the mic here, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
So the question was just curious.
You need to speak up a little bit
Can
more.
you hear me now?
Yeah.
For the rest of the audience, not so much for
Sorry.
the author.
Yeah. So the question which I was thinking as you were talking about one of your books being adapted to cinema, there's always an element of visualization. But since then, do you feel conscious as you're writing of the possibility of the book becoming a film? And does that impact on your writing?
Yeah. Fair question. I mean, I asked this question before, saying that do you write with an eye towards cinema? Not really. And let me try and be honest about that answer. You see, I'm primarily an imagery-driven person. If I can't see a scene, I can't write it. So if I'm describing a character, some people would start off saying, this person is about 35 years old, is an engineer, is married with 2 children, and so on and so forth. In other words, provide demographic details of that character. I would probably start by saying, the light fell on his face and cut the face in half. And it seemed that there were 2 sides to this person. Do you see what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to visualize this person. So my writing is imagery-driven. No matter which novel I've written, my novels tend to be imagery-driven. And therefore, as I move from one scene to another, I'm seeing a whole slew of images in front of me, which makes it actually very amenable to cinema. Okay? So although I'm not consciously trying to write so that I want to excite a director or I want to excite a producer into writing, what I'm in essence doing is I'm writing in cinematic language. Okay? And this is, I'm not saying everybody has to write like that. This is the way I am. Yeah?
Right. There's a gentleman at the back there.
Borunda.
Brinda.
Borunda is early for his session, which is coming up on Shankar. Do attend it on Kolkata and Shankar.
I didn't recognize him.
What prevents you from translating your own work into either Bengali or English?
I did ask that question.
I'm sorry,
I think
I
no,
missed it.
that's fine.
Yeah.
Can you
Sorry.
Because I'd be horribly bad at it, Borunda. Translators need special skills. And the other thing is, I have a wavering mind. I've written the story of Tejashwini or Shabnam. If I were to translate it into English, I would want to change the story midway and change the story and write something else.
So it will be Shabnam too, perhaps.
Perhaps. But I would leave it in the competent hands of somebody else to do it.
Maybe why you don't do that, because you might think that it's a waste of time. I've already written this story, and let me engage myself writing something else.
That's
perhaps.
right. Okay, I'm variety seeking, yeah.
Right. We have time for one more question. So one last question, if anyone would like to ask. Right. The gentleman there.
Hello.
Hi.
This story about 2 mothers, you said, right? Someone is trying to find who is the mother. If this story is set in today's time, it should be very easy, isn't it? Just do a DNA test. Means, what's the problem?
I'm so glad you asked this question. I can't tell you, I'm so delighted that you asked this question. Because, this is exactly what happens in the novel. So at one point, the question is, why should there be any mystery? Why not just conduct a DNA test and find out if Jamuna is the mother, if Urvashi is the mother, or if neither are their mothers? But hang on. When I was writing this novel, I started researching DNA testing. So I visited top scholars of DNA who determine paternity, maternity, forensic DNA testing, and I took classes and tutorials on DNA analysis. And guess what? The DNA tests are done by human beings, and therefore a DNA test is as corruptible as any other test. If you want to corrupt a DNA test and bias the results towards one, you can do that very easily. If you want to bribe a laboratory assistant and change the blood sample which is inside a cold freezer, you can do that easily. You can replace the sample of human blood by the blood of a dog if you want to. Okay? In other words, we think of science as being the ultimate arbiter. It is not. It's ultimately the humans who conduct the scientific tests. Okay? I don't want to tell you anything more, because what happens in the novel is high suspense builds up when the DNA testing starts happening. And the two mothers fight over who is going to be the winner in the DNA analysis.
Right. I've had a fantastic time, very selfishly speaking. And you've been a wonderful audience, and I would probably hazard a guess that you haven't, you've kind of enjoyed yourself as well. You haven't had such a bad time here as well. You've been wonderful. Kunalda, you've been absolutely fabulous. It's been a great adda. Kunalda will be signing books, you know, the storybook store right outside the gates. And if you'd like to get your copies signed, you could just nip across.
Dhanyabad. Thank you.
Thank you very much.